Welcome back, everyone, and if you're new here, I'm so glad you found the channel. We're on an exciting journey to reach 10k subscribers by next year, and every like, comment and subscription brings us one step closer. Your support means everything. Now, let's jump into today's video. In the small, forgotten town of Eldridge, nestled at the base of the Blackthorn Mountains, mist clung to the cobblestone streets like a persistent ghost. The town itself seemed to exist in a state of perpetual twilight, with shadows that stretched too long and darkness that fell too early. Many travellers passed through quickly, feeling an inexplicable unease they couldn't quite name. At the edge of town stood the Eldridge Museum of the Unseen, a Victorian monstrosity of weathered stone and wrought iron gates. Its Gothic spires pierced the fog-laden sky, and gargoyles with expressions of perpetual agony guarded its entrance. The museum was rarely visited by outsiders, existing primarily for the handful of locals who understood its true purpose, not to preserve history, but to contain it. Samuel Price had been the curator for nearly 4 decades, though he appeared much older than his 68 years would suggest. His spine curved like a question mark, and his thin white hair floated around his head in wisps. Deep-set eyes, almost unnaturally bright, peered out from a gaunt face covered in liver spots. Samuel moved through the museum's halls with practiced caution, his footsteps deliberately placed, as if he knew precisely which floorboards to avoid. Every night at precisely 8:17 p.m, Samuel would make his way to the western wing of the museum, unlocking 7 doors with 7 different keys before reaching his destination, a chamber sealed with ancient symbols and modern locks. Inside, on a pedestal of black marble, sat the Relic, a grotesque stone statue depicting a creature neither human nor animal. Its body was serpentine, yet angular, with multiple eyes arranged in a pattern that defied natural biology. Samuel would sit before it for hours, sometimes murmuring in languages long extinct, his face reflecting an emotion somewhere between reverence and terror. For 500 years the relic had remained dormant, its existence known only to a select few, until now. The university van rumbled along the winding mountain road, carrying 4 archaeology students from Ashford University. Professor Blackwood had assigned them a challenging task for their final thesis: document and analyze artifacts from small, overlooked historical sites. The Eldridge Museum of the Unseen had barely registered in academic circles, making it perfect for their purpose. "This place better be worth the 3-hour drive," Lucas Donovan said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the map on his tablet. With short brown hair and a perpetually skeptical expression, Lucas approached everything methodically, his small digital camera ready to document their findings. "There's almost nothing about it online." "That's exactly why it's perfect," Ethan Wilson replied, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Tall and broad-shouldered, with an easy smile that charmed professors and museum directors alike, Ethan had built a reputation for accessing restricted areas where others couldn't. Unexplored territory means original research. Original research means top marks. From the back seat, Maya Patel looked up from her notebook, where she'd been translating passages from an obscure text on regional folklore. According to local legends, Eldridge was founded by a group escaping religious persecution in the 1500s. They supposedly brought sacred objects with them from their homeland. "Sacred objects or cursed objects?" Jasmine Winters asked quietly, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of her long black hair. The youngest of the group at 20, Jasmine had an uncanny intuition that her friends had learned to respect. "I've had dreams about this place since you mentioned it last week. Dark dreams." "Your dreams are why I wanted to come here in the first place," Ethan said, flashing a smile in the rearview mirror. "Your weird feelings usually lead to the most interesting discoveries." As they crested the final hill, Eldridge came into view. Grey stone buildings, huddled together like mourners at a funeral, the imposing museum looming above them all. The few people visible on the street stopped to stare as the van passed, their expressions unreadable. "Friendly folks," Lucas muttered, taking pictures through the window. "They don't get many visitors," Maya said, "especially not academics." Ethan parked in front of the museum, its massive wooden doors appearing perpetually on the verge of closing. "Remember," he said, grabbing his backpack, "we need exclusive access to the restricted collections. Whatever it takes." Samuel Price had been dusting the glass case containing a collection of ancient farming tools when he heard the museum's doors open, an unusual occurrence on a Wednesday afternoon. 4 young people entered, their modern clothing and eager expressions immediately marking them as outsiders. Samuel's hand instinctively reached for the protective amulet he kept in his pocket. "Welcome to the Eldridge Museum of the Unseen," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "We rarely receive visitors from the university." He noticed their surprised expressions and smiled thinly. "Your school emblems," he explained, pointing to their backpacks. Ethan stepped forward with an outstretched hand. "I'm Ethan Wilson. These are my colleagues, Maya, Lucas, and Jasmine. We're archaeology students working on our thesis projects. Professor Blackwood suggested your museum might house some overlooked treasures." Samuel didn't take Ethan's hand. "Arthur Blackwood sent you?" A shadow passed over his face. "Interesting. He swore never to return to Eldridge after his last visit." "You know our professor?" Maya asked, already taking notes. "We were colleagues once," Samuel replied vaguely, before certain disagreements about research methods. He studied them carefully, his gaze lingering on Jasmine, who had drifted toward a display of protection symbols. "You feel it, don't you, young lady? The weight of this place." Jasmine nodded without speaking, her fingers hovering near, but not touching, a circular stone tablet covered in spiraling symbols. "Very well," Samuel said after a long pause. "I'll show you the main collection. Some areas, however, remain private, for preservation purposes." As Samuel led them through the museum's winding halls, he pointed out artifacts with stories far more detailed than their small display placards suggested. A shepherd's crook that allegedly controlled minds. A mirror that showed reflections of people long dead. A music box that played only in the presence of imminent danger. Lucas diligently photographed everything, while Maya translated inscriptions Samuel claimed to be misidentified by previous scholars. Ethan charmed the curator with insightful questions, gradually steering the conversation toward the museum's restricted areas. Jasmine remained quiet, the discomfort growing with each exhibit. In a back corner of the third gallery, behind a velvet rope, stood a plain wooden door with an intricate iron lock. "And what's through there?" Ethan asked casually. "Storage," Samuel answered too quickly. "Nothing of interest." "Your hands are shaking, Mr. Price," Maya observed gently. Samuel clenched his bony fingers together. "It's been a long day. Perhaps we should continue tomorrow." "Of course," Ethan agreed smoothly. "But before we go, Professor Blackwood mentioned a particular artifact. Something unique to your collection." He paused deliberately. "Something about a statue with unusual eyes." The colour drained from Samuel's face. "He told you about that? Impossible. The agreement was—" He stopped himself, suddenly aware of how much he was revealing. "You should leave, now." "Please, Mr. Price," Maya interjected. "We've come all this way. At least tell us about it, for academic purposes." Samuel looked at each of them in turn, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, his eyes settled on Jasmine. "You," he said, "would you enter that room if given the chance?" Without hesitation, Jasmine answered, "No." Samuel nodded, seemingly satisfied. "At least one of you has sense." He sighed deeply. "Return tomorrow at sunset. I'll show you what Professor Blackwood is so interested in. But you must follow my instructions precisely. The artifact is sensitive." As they left the museum, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across Eldridge. The townspeople watched from windows and doorways, their expressions unreadable. "That was weird," Lucas said as they climbed into the van. "Did you notice how he kept referring to the artifacts as if they were alive?" "He's an eccentric old man in an isolated town," Ethan replied. "But he's going to show us something special tomorrow, and that's what matters." "I don't think we should go back," Jasmine said quietly. "There's something wrong with that place, with this whole town." "Your intuition has saved us before," Maya acknowledged, "but we've come too far to turn back now." None of them noticed the figure of Samuel Price watching from the museum's highest window, or the silent tears streaming down his withered face. They spent the night in Eldridge's only inn, a creaking wooden structure with 4 sparsely furnished rooms. The innkeeper, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Holloway, provided a simple dinner without conversation, her eyes constantly darting to the windows as darkness fell. While the others slept, Maya remained awake, poring over her research by flashlight. In an obscure journal article about early American cults, she found a brief reference to Eldridge. Founded by followers of the entity known as Draegoth, bringing with them the vessel of containment. In another room, Jasmine tossed in her sleep, her dreams filled with a many-eyed creature speaking in a language that hurt her mind. She awoke at 3:27 a.m., gasping for breath, certain she had heard someone whispering her name. Morning brought heavy fog and an unsettling silence. No birds sang in Eldridge. "I found something," Maya told the others over breakfast. She showed them the journal article and several other references she'd compiled. Eldridge wasn't founded by people escaping persecution. They were the ones being persecuted, for worshipping something called Draegoth. "Sounds like standard witch hunt stuff," Lucas said, though he looked uncomfortable. "I had dreams about eyes," Jasmine whispered. "Eyes that blinked." Ethan seemed excited rather than concerned. "This just gets better. Cults, mysterious entities. Our thesis will be the talk of the department." They spent the day interviewing reluctant townspeople and photographing the unusual architecture of Eldridge. Buildings with too many corners, windows placed at odd heights, doors that seemed too narrow for comfortable passage. By late afternoon they had gathered enough material for several papers, yet the real prize awaited them at the museum. Samuel Price met them at the entrance as the sun began to set, his face even more haggard than before. "You've been asking questions in town," he said, not bothering with greetings, "drawing attention." "Research," Ethan replied with a shrug. "Foolishness," Samuel snapped. He hesitated, then added more softly, "There's still time to leave." But Ethan was already moving past him into the museum. "You promised to show us the artifact, Mr. Price, the statue with the eyes." Samuel's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Very well, follow me. Touch nothing without permission." He led them through the familiar galleries, then unlocked the wooden door they'd seen yesterday. Beyond it lay a narrow corridor lined with glass cases containing objects covered by velvet cloths. At the end stood another door, this one reinforced with metal bands and marked with symbols similar to those Jasmine had noticed on the protection tablet. Samuel produced a ring of 7 uniquely shaped keys. As he unlocked the door, he spoke in a low monotone. "What you are about to see has been in Eldridge for 5 centuries. It was brought here by the town's founders, who stole it from its original temple in a land whose name is now forgotten. They believed it contained power they could control." His voice took on a bitter edge. They were wrong. The door swung open to reveal a circular chamber with a high domed ceiling. The walls were covered in intricate carvings and more protective symbols. In the center, bathed in the light of a single overhead lamp, stood a pedestal of black marble. On it sat the relic. The statue was smaller than they had expected, perhaps 2 feet tall, but its presence filled the room. Carved from some dark stone with an unnatural luster, It depicted a creature that seemed to shift between serpentine and humanoid forms, depending on the angle of view. Its body twisted in anatomically impossible ways, and 7 eyes of varying sizes were arranged across what might have been its head. "The vessel of Draegoth," Samuel said reverently. "For 500 years it has been contained here, sealed by rituals performed by each generation of curators." Lucas raised his camera, but Samuel grasped his wrist with surprising strength. "No photographs, no recordings of any kind." "What exactly is it supposed to be?" Maya asked, already taking notes despite Samuel's warning. "A deity? A demon?" "Neither. Both. The people who created it had different concepts than we do," Samuel replied. "They believed Draegoth existed between worlds, seeing all possible realities through its many eyes. They carved this vessel to commune with it, but the entity became trapped within." "Trapped?" Ethan repeated, moving closer to the pedestal. "You talk about it like it's alive." "It sleeps," Samuel said. "It must always sleep. When the founders of Eldridge stole the vessel, they awakened it briefly. The results were," he gestured vaguely, "catastrophic. Since then, it has been our burden to ensure it remains dormant." Jasmine had backed against the wall, as far from the statue as possible. "It's watching us," she whispered. "Right now, it's angry." "Impossible," Samuel said sharply. "The seals are intact. The eyes haven't opened in 5 centuries. Ethan circled the pedestal, studying the statue from all angles. "These carvings on the base, are they part of the sealing ritual?" "Yes," Samuel answered, tensing as Ethan leaned closer. "Please maintain your distance." But Ethan's curiosity had always outweighed his caution. "The craftsmanship is incredible. The eyes look almost real, like they could—" "Don't!" Jasmine cried. Too late. Ethan's fingertips brushed against the statue's surface. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, the central eye of the statue blinked. Samuel's anguished cry filled the chamber. "What have you done?" The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against their eardrums. The temperature plummeted, their breath suddenly visible in white clouds. A deep, subsonic vibration began, more felt than heard, rising from the floor and through their bodies. "Get out!" Samuel shouted, pushing them towards the door. "All of you now!" But as they reached the threshold, a violent tremor shook the building. Ethan stumbled backward, falling against the pedestal. The statue toppled, rolling onto the floor with a sound far louder than its size should have produced. On the floor, all 7 eyes of the statue opened wide, fixing on Ethan with terrible awareness. A voice filled the chamber, not a sound but a presence in their minds speaking without language, yet perfectly understood. "I am awake." Blood began to trickle from Ethan's eyes, ears and nose. He screamed, clutching his head, his body convulsing. The others stood paralyzed, unable to move or look away as Ethan's agony played out before them. Samuel alone seemed capable of action. He grabbed the statue, heedless of the danger, and placed it back on the pedestal. From his pocket, he produced a small cloth bag, sprinkling its contents, a powder that smelled of grave soil and ancient incense, around the relic while chanting in a language none of the students recognized. The tremors subsided. The voice receded. Ethan collapsed, unconscious but alive. "Help me with him," Samuel commanded, his authority absolute in that moment. Together they carried Ethan from the chamber. Samuel locked the door behind them, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the keys twice. In the main gallery, they laid Ethan on a bench. His breathing was shallow, his skin deathly pale, except for dark veins visible beneath the surface. "What happened to him?" Maya demanded, her academic detachment shattered by fear for her friend. "He touched it," Samuel said simply. "He woke it, and now it has marked him." He looked at them with tired, ancient eyes. "It has marked all of you, and through you, it will spread." "Spread what?" Lucas asked. his skepticism giving way to dread. "The awakening," Samuel replied. "Draegoth has been waiting for centuries. Now the cycle begins again." He turned away, moving toward a bookshelf behind the reception desk. "There may still be time to contain it, if we act quickly." "This is insane," Lucas protested. "Ethan needs a hospital, not whatever mumbo-jumbo you're planning." Samuel pulled an ancient leather-bound book from the shelf. "Take him to a hospital if you wish. It won't help. By morning, the changes will already be visible." "Changes?" Maya echoed. "The transformation," Samuel said grimly. "Draegoth requires a vessel of flesh, not just stone. Ethan touched it first. He will become its primary host." Jasmine, who had been silent since the chamber, suddenly spoke. "He's telling the truth. I can feel it inside me too. Weaker, but there. Watching through my eyes. Listening through my ears." "All of you should leave Eldridge immediately," Samuel continued. "Go as far away as possible. It might slow the spread." "We're not abandoning Ethan," Maya insisted. "Then you do more than just yourselves," Samuel replied. "But if you insist on staying, help me prepare. We have until dawn before the first stage completes." They took Ethan to the inn, ignoring Mrs. Holloway's horrified expression at his condition. In their largest room, they laid him on the bed, while Samuel mixed herbs and powders from a small case he carried. "I've suspected this day might come," he explained as he worked. "I've prepared as best I could." "You knew this would happen," Lucas accused. "I knew it could happen," Samuel corrected. "The seals weaken over time. The ritual must be renewed each generation." His hands trembled as he crushed dried leaves in a small mortar. "I had no apprentice, no one to pass the knowledge to. The people of Eldridge have forgotten the old ways, forgotten why their ancestors settled here." "To guard the relic," Maya said, connecting the pieces. "This whole town exists to keep it contained." "Yes," Samuel agreed, "though few remember the truth now. They feel the weight of their purpose without understanding it. It's why they stay, despite the hardship. Why they fear outsiders." He glanced at Jasmine. "Some still have the old sensitivity. They can feel Draegoth's presence even in its slumber." Jasmine nodded slowly. "The dreams, the whispering. It's been calling us here, hasn't it? Calling Ethan specifically." "Perhaps," Samuel admitted. "Draegoth exists beyond our understanding of time. It may have been waiting for him, for all of you, for centuries." Throughout the night, they took turns watching over Ethan. His condition deteriorated rapidly, his temperature soaring, his skin taking on a greyish cast, dark veins spreading across his face in patterns reminiscent of the statue's surface. Shortly before dawn, he awoke with a gasping breath, his eyes open wide, completely black, without iris or white. He spoke in a voice not his own, deeper and resonating with strange harmonics. "I see you all," he said, his gaze passing over each of them. "My witnesses, my vessels, my harbingers." Samuel moved quickly, pressing a cloth soaked in a pungent liquid over Ethan's face. After a brief struggle, Ethan fell back into unconsciousness. "It won't hold him for long," Samuel warned. "The transformation is progressing faster than I expected. We need to return to the museum, to my archives. There's an old text that describes the binding ritual that first trapped Draegoth in the stone vessel." Outside, the sky had taken on a reddish tint, though the sun had yet to rise. As they made their way through the streets, they noticed townspeople watching from windows, some making protective gestures as they passed. They know, Maya realized. On some level, they can sense what's happening. "The blood remembers," Samuel said cryptically. At the museum, Samuel led them to his private office, a cluttered room filled with books and artifacts not on display. From a locked cabinet, he retrieved a metal box covered in protective symbols. Inside lay a crumbling manuscript, written in faded brown ink. "The journal of Elias Price, my ancestor, the first curator," Samuel explained. He recorded the ritual that sealed Draegoth after the last awakening. Maya leaned over the fragile pages. I recognize some of these symbols from the chamber. The binding requires specific conditions, Samuel said as he carefully turned the pages. The vessel, both stone and flesh, must be brought to the sacred circle at the summit of Blackthorn Peak. The ritual must be performed as the moon reaches its zenith. "That's tonight," Jasmine said immediately, certainty in her voice. "Full moon?" Samuel nodded. "Yes. We have until midnight to prepare. But there's more." His face grew grave. "The ritual requires a sacrifice, a willing soul to replace the bond that was broken." The weight of his words settled over them. "You mean someone has to die?" Lucas said flatly. "To save many more," Samuel confirmed. "It is the price of containment." As they debated the impossible choice before them, a scream pierced the morning air, coming from the direction of the inn. They rushed outside to find people gathering in the street, pointing toward the inn where every window had shattered outward. Mrs. Holloway stood in the doorway, her face ashen. "He's gone," she told them as they approached. "The young man, something terrible has happened to him." The room where they'd left Ethan was destroyed. The furniture splintered, the walls gouged with marks that could not have been made by human hands. A trail of blackish fluid led from the bed to the window and down the exterior wall. "He's transforming more rapidly than I anticipated," Samuel said, his voice tight with fear. "Draegoth's influence strengthens as it spreads." He turned to the students. "Are any of you experiencing symptoms, headaches, visions, changes in perception?" They exchanged uncomfortable glances. "I've been hearing whispers," Maya admitted. "Names I don't recognize in languages I shouldn't understand." "The statue's growl follows me everywhere," Lucas added, reluctantly, "even when I cover my ears." Jasmine simply nodded, her expression saying enough. Samuel's shoulders sagged. "It's already begun. The corruption is spreading through you, and soon through everyone you encounter. We must find Ethan and complete the ritual before Draegoth fully manifests." They split up to search the town, agreeing to meet at noon. The sky continued to darken to a deep crimson, and a hot, dry wind began to blow from the mountains. As they moved through Eldridge, they noticed subtle changes. Plants withering, animals acting erratically, people arguing in the streets over perceived slights. Maya found herself drawn to the small town library, where ancient texts suddenly made perfect sense despite being written in languages she had never studied. Knowledge flowed into her mind unbidden. Terrible secrets about Draegoth's true nature and the civilizations it had previously destroyed. Lucas, searching the western part of town, discovered he could hear conversations through walls, his senses heightened to supernatural levels. But with each passing hour, the growl in his ears grew louder, threatening to drown out all other sounds. Jasmine, who had gone to the church at the town centre, found herself surrounded by shadowy figures, visible only in her peripheral vision. They whispered guidance, leading her to a hidden chamber beneath the altar where clay tablets depicted the original binding of Draegoth thousands of years ago. By noon, when they reconvened at the museum, each had new information and new manifestations of Draegoth's influence. Maya's eyes had developed flecks of obsidian black. Lucas's hearing had become so acute that he wrapped his head in a scarf to dampen the sensory overload. Jasmine's shadow no longer matched her movements, sometimes stretching toward the museum, regardless of the sun's position. "No sign of Ethan," Maya reported, "but the townspeople are changing too. I saw a man arguing with his reflection in a store window. When he punched it, his hand came back with too many fingers." "The barrier between worlds is thinning," Samuel explained. "Draegoth exists in multiple realities simultaneously. As its power grows, those realities begin to overlap with our own." "We found these," Jasmine said, placing the clay tablets on the table. They show a ritual older than the one in your ancestors' journal, before the stone vessel was created. Samuel studied the tablets with growing concern. This depicts the original binding when Draegoth was still a formless entity. The stone vessel was created to contain it after this ritual weakened it. He looked up, his expression grim. If Ethan completes his transformation before tonight, Draegoth may no longer need the vessel. It will be free to take its true form. And what happens then? Lucas asked. The end, Samuel said simply, at least for our reality. A sudden, violent tremor shook the building, stronger than the one they'd experienced in the chamber. Books fell from shelves and dust rained from the ceiling. Through the windows they saw a plume of dark smoke rising from the northern edge of town. He's at the old mill, Samuel said, gathering his materials with shaking hands. We must go now, before he grows stronger. The journey through town became increasingly surreal. Streets twisted in impossible ways, sometimes requiring them to double back or take unexpected turns to reach their destination. Townspeople either hid in their homes or wandered aimlessly, some mumbling to themselves, others standing perfectly still with their faces turned toward the crimson sky. The old mill stood at the edge of a dried-up riverbed, its wooden structure blackened as if by intense heat. Inside, the air was thick with a sweet, rotting smell. Machinery lay twisted and melted, and the wooden floorboards had been torn up to expose the earth beneath. In the center of the main room, Ethan knelt in a circle of disturbed soil. His transformation had progressed horribly, his skin now a mottled grey with the texture of stone, his fingers elongated into sharp talons, his back hunched with new protrusions that resembled the beginnings of wings, or perhaps additional limbs. When he turned at their approach, his face had become a grotesque approximation of the statue's features, 7 eyes arranged across his distorted features. "My friends," he said in that resonant voice, "my vessels, you've come to witness the ascension." "Ethan," Maya called out, her voice breaking, "if you're still in there, you have to fight it. This thing is using you." Ethan, or the thing that had been Ethan, tilted its head at an unnatural angle. "Ethan is becoming more than he was, as all of you will. As all will." It gestured around the room. "The barriers weaken. Soon I will see through every eye, speak through every mouth, reach through every hand." Samuel stepped forward, holding a small cloth bag similar to the one he'd used in the chamber. "Draegoth," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "By the old pact, I command you to return to your vessel." The creature laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "The pact is broken. The time of watching is over. Now is the time of becoming." It pointed at Samuel with a taloned finger. "You have failed, Guardian, as did your father and his father before him. You let the seals weaken. You invited them in." It turned its multiple eyes to the students. They were chosen long ago, their bloodlines marked from birth. My keys to freedom. With shocking speed, the creature lunged forward, grabbing Samuel by the throat and lifting him off the ground. "Your line ends today, Guardian. The cycle breaks." Lucas and Maya rushed forward, trying to pull the creature away from Samuel. Their touch seemed to cause it pain. It released Samuel with a hiss, its skin smoking where they had grabbed it. "The corruption is not complete in you yet," it snarled. "You still have power over this form, but not for long." Jasmine remained in the doorway, her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent recitation. The shadows around her swirled unnaturally. Samuel, gasping for breath, pulled himself to his feet. "The summit," he wheezed. "We must complete the ritual at the summit." The creature that had been Ethan laughed again. "Yes, run to your sacred place. I will follow. All paths lead to me now." They retreated from the mill, half carrying Samuel between them. As they reached the street, the ground behind them erupted, earthen tendrils snaking after them before subsiding. "The mountain path," Samuel directed, pointing toward a narrow trail visible at the edge of town. "Quickly before it recovers." The climb up Blackthorn Peak was arduous under normal circumstances. Now, with reality itself becoming unstable, it was nightmarish. The path shifted beneath their feet, sometimes doubling back on itself or ending abruptly at sheer drops that hadn't existed moments before. The crimson sky darkened further, and unnatural lightning flashed between the clouds. Samuel, drawing on reserves of strength belied by his frail appearance, led them ever upward, consulting Elias's journal at confusing junctions. Maya supported him physically, while reciting protective chants he taught her. Lucas, his enhanced hearing, allowing him to detect the creature's pursuit, kept watch behind them. Jasmine moved as if in a trance, sometimes pausing to mark symbols in the dirt that momentarily stabilized the path. By sunset, they had reached a plateau near the summit. Here, stone monoliths arranged in a circle surrounded a central altar, clearly ancient, predating even the founding of Eldridge. "The binding place," Samuel explained, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Prepare the ritual while I set the wards." Working quickly in the fading light, they used materials from Samuel's pack to mark the necessary symbols on the altar and around the perimeter. As the full moon rose over the mountain, the air grew still and heavy, like the calm before a devastating storm. "He's coming," Lucas warned, his head cocked as he listened to sounds beyond normal hearing. "And he's not alone." Through the gathering darkness, they saw figures approaching, townspeople moving with jerky, uncoordinated steps, their features distorted in the moonlight. Leading them was the creature that had been Ethan, now further transformed. Its body seemed larger, its movements more fluid, as if the human form it wore was becoming merely a suggestion rather than a constraint. "The vessel calls to its fragments," Samuel said, nodding towards the stone monoliths, which had begun to emit a faint purple glow. "The original binding circle seeks to remake itself." The creature stopped at the edge of the circle, its followers arrayed behind it. "A touching effort," it said, its voice somehow coming from all directions at once. "But futile. The old magic weakens as belief dies. How many in Eldridge still remember the true purpose of their town? How many still honor the old pact?" It gestured at the blank-faced townspeople. "These sheep know nothing of sacrifice or duty." "Then we will remind them," Samuel replied. He raised Elias's journal high. "By blood and oath, by stone and star, we renew the pact." The monoliths flared brighter, their light forming a barrier that pushed back the possessed townspeople. Only the creature remained unaffected, stepping into the circle with casual disregard for the ancient protections. "Your ritual is incomplete, Guardian," it said. "You know what it requires." Its multiple eyes blinked in sequence. "Which of you offers yourself to the binding? Which soul will spend eternity containing my essence?" It turned slowly, regarding each of them. "Not you, Guardian. Your line is spent, your strength faded. Not you, Hearer." It pointed to Lucas. "Your fear overwhelms your resolve. Not you, Shadow Walker." It faced Jasmine. "You are already partly mine, your spirit divided." Its gaze finally settled on Maya. "But you, reader of forgotten words, you would sacrifice yourself, wouldn't you? For knowledge, for your friends, for the world you think you're saving." Maya stood straighter, her face set with determination, despite the fear evident in her eyes. "If that's what it takes to stop you, yes." The creature smiled, a horrific sight on its distorted face. "Noble, pointless but noble." Samuel began the ritual, his voice strengthened by desperation. The words of the old language echoed across the mountain top, each syllable visibly rippling the air. Maya stood at the altar, her hands placed on symbols that glowed at her touch. Lucas and Jasmine completed the triangle around the creature, which made no move to escape. "Your ritual binds nothing without the sacrifice. it said with smug confidence. Which of you will die tonight? Whose soul will be torn from flesh to forge the chains of my prison? It spread its arms wide. Choose quickly. The hour of ascension approaches. The moon reached its zenith, its light unnaturally bright on the circle of stones. Samuel's chanting reached a crescendo, the final words of the binding spell hanging in the air like physical things. In that moment of suspension, Maya stepped forward. I offer myself to the binding. No, Jasmine cried, breaking her position. The creature laughed triumphantly. Too late, Shadow Walker, the choice is made. But as Maya approached the center of the circle, Samuel suddenly lunged forward, pushing her aside. Not you, he said. My family began this cycle. I will end it. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed the creature's transformed face between his hands. By my blood, by my soul, by my willing sacrifice, I bind thee. A blinding flash of purple light erupted from the contact point. Samuel and the creature both screamed, one in agony, one in rage. The air itself seemed to tear open, revealing glimpses of other realities, other versions of the mountaintop, other beings watching from beyond the veil. The monoliths cracked with thunderous reports, energy pouring from them into the struggling figures at the circle's center. Samuel's body began to dissolve, turning to luminous ash that swirled around the creature like a cyclone of light. The creature thrashed and howled, its multiple eyes blazing with hatred and fear. No, it roared in a voice that shattered stone. Not again! I will not be contained. The students watched in horror and awe as Samuel's sacrifice unfolded. His physical form completely disintegrated, becoming pure energy that encircled the creature, binding it with chains of light that sank into its transformed flesh. The creature that had been Ethan convulsed, its body contorting as two forces fought for dominance within it. Keep the circle, Maya shouted to the others, over the howling wind that had sprung up around them. The ritual isn't complete. Lucas and Jasmine returned to their positions, their hands outstretched to maintain the triangle of power. The possessed townspeople at the perimeter had collapsed, writhing on the ground as Draegoth's influence wavered. The creature fell to its knees, Samuel's voice somehow emanating from it alongside Draegoth's. The vessel, bring it here, quickly. Maya hesitated, then understood. The statue, we need the stone vessel. It's too late, Lucas shouted back. It's still at the museum. But Jasmine, her connection to the shadows deeper than ever, closed her eyes in concentration. The darkness around her feet deepened, spreading across the ground like spilled ink. From this pool of shadow rose the stone statue of Draegoth, its 7 eyes now glowing with the same purple light as the monoliths. How did you... Lucas began. Later, Maya cut him off, grabbing the statue and rushing to the center of the circle. The creature reached for the vessel with clawed hands that were already beginning to lose their solidity. As it touched the stone, a shockwave of energy knocked the students backward. When they looked up, the transformed body of Ethan lay motionless on the ground, and the statue stood on the altar, its eyes closed once more, but now with new carvings on its base that resembled Samuel's features in eternal vigilance. Silence fell over the mountain. The crimson sky gradually returned to normal, stars appearing one by one. The townspeople stirred, confused and disoriented, but seemingly themselves again. Maya crawled to Ethan's side, fearing the worst, but as she reached him, he groaned, his eyelids fluttering. When they opened, his eyes were normal again, confused, frightened, but human. What happened? He asked weakly. I had the most terrible dream. Jasmine knelt beside them, tears streaming down her face. It's over, she said. Samuel saved us. He saved everyone. Lucas approached the altar cautiously, studying the statue with new understanding. Not over, he corrected solemnly. Contained. Until next time. They carried Ethan and the statue down the mountain as dawn broke over Eldridge. The town seemed somehow smaller in the morning light, its buildings more weathered, its streets emptier. Many residents were packing their belongings, fleeing now that Draegoth's subconscious hold on them had weakened. In the museum, they found Samuel's office transformed. The clutter had been replaced by a perfect circle drawn on the floor, with 7 specific points marked around its circumference. At its center stood a new pedestal, seemingly grown from the wooden floorboards themselves. He prepared this, Maya realized. He knew what would happen. They placed the statue on the pedestal, feeling a subtle shift in the air as it settled into place. The museum itself seemed to exhale, its structure adjusting around this new arrangement. Ethan, still weak but recovering, studied the statue with horror and fascination. "I remember parts of it," he admitted, "being inside there with it. And Samuel. He's containing it somehow, fighting it constantly." He shuddered. "He sacrificed himself for us, for everyone." "For now," Jasmine said, her newfound connection to the shadows giving her insights the others lacked. "But the cycle will continue. Draegoth is weakened, not destroyed. In time it will gather strength again." "How long?" Lucas asked. Jasmine touched the statue's base, where Samuel's face was now carved in stone. "Decades. Centuries, perhaps. It depends on how long Samuel's spirit can maintain the binding." Maya opened Elias's journal, which they had brought back from the mountain. "Then we need to be ready when that time comes. Someone needs to remember. Someone needs to know what to do." She looked at each of them in turn. Someone needs to stay. They understood the implication. The curse of Eldridge had not ended. It had merely entered a new phase, and they, whether by chance or by Draegoth's design, were now part of it. In the weeks that followed, they made their choice. Ethan returned to Ashford, too traumatized by his experience to remain in Eldridge, but he promised to document everything he remembered, creating a record for future generations. Lucas, his heightened senses never fully returning to normal, decided to travel, seeking other artifacts and entities like Draegoth, knowledge that might someday prove crucial. Maya and Jasmine stayed, establishing themselves as the new guardians of the Eldridge Museum of the Unseen. They converted the building's upper floor into living quarters and research space, dedicating themselves to understanding the full history of Draegoth and the binding ritual. They took on the responsibility of renewing the protective symbols, strengthening the seals, and preparing for the day when the 7 eyes would open once more. They kept the statue in its chamber, accessible only through 7 doors with 7 keys, and they never touched its cold stone surface. Once a year, on the anniversary of Samuel's sacrifice, they would visit the Circle of Monoliths on Blackthorn Peak, leaving offerings and renewing their commitment to the watch. Sometimes when the moon was full and the night was clear, they thought they could hear Samuel's voice on the wind, still chanting the ancient words of binding. Life in Eldridge slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. New residents arrived, unaware of the town's true purpose. The museum became known as a quirky local attraction, its most dangerous artifacts disguised as harmless curiosities. But Maya and Jasmine never forgot. They trained themselves in the old ways, studied the forgotten languages, and kept the knowledge alive. They knew that one day, perhaps long after their own lives had ended, the cycle would begin again. The relic would blink, the warning signs would appear, and someone would need to be ready. 10 years after that fateful night, Maya completed her thesis, not the one she had originally planned, but a comprehensive study of protective symbols and rituals across cultures. In its acknowledgements, she wrote, "To SP, who taught us the meaning of sacrifice and whose vigilance continues." 50 years later, Jasmine, now an elderly woman with silver hair but still sharp eyes, trained a young, sensitive girl who had come to the museum and felt drawn to the sealed chamber. "The eyes are watching," the girl had said, though she had never seen the statue. Jasmine recognized the signs and began her education. 100 years after Samuel's sacrifice, a university student named Michael arrived in Eldridge, drawn by dreams of many eyes and whispered promises of knowledge. He convinced the new curator to show him the museum's restricted collection. As he approached the sealed chamber, the air grew heavy and thick. Behind 7 doors, locked with 7 keys, on a pedestal of wood that had grown rather than been carved, the ancient relic waited. Its stone surface gleamed in the dim light, its multiple eyes closed but somehow aware. The face of Samuel Price, worn by time but still recognizable, remained vigilant on its base. As Michael stepped into the chamber, somewhere deep within the relic, something stirred. Not yet awakening, but shifting in its slumber. Dreaming of freedom, waiting for the cycle to begin again. For it was the end, and yet it was only the beginning.